everyone, and welcome to the March edition of the MAPS Canada Journal Club. So unfortunately, we had a family emergency for one of our speakers today, so we will only be having Terence joining us to give his presentation. But just a quick intro to what MAPS Journal Club is. It is a monthly initiative for the academic discussion of psychedelic studies, and this was started by students from University of Toronto, McMaster University, and Queen's University as well. And so for today, we have Dr. Terence Ching presenting on the effects of psychedelic use on racial trauma symptoms and ethnic identity amongst Asians in North America. So Terence Ching is a postdoctoral associate at the Yale OCD Research Clinic. His research and clinical interests are at the intersection of fear and trauma-based disorders, cultural diversity, and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Terence has completed MAPS-sponsored MDMA-assisted psychotherapy training, served as a study therapist on a phase 2 multi-site open-label trial, and is currently assisting and co-developing randomized clinical trials for psilocybin therapy for OCD. And so with that, let's give a warm welcome to Terence, who will now take over.
First of all, thank you for inviting me for this journal club session. And I look forward to future invites to just listen to other wonderful researchers talking about their work. Today, as mentioned, I'm going to talk about a recent publication coming from our lab. It's a collaboration with Dr. Monica Williams and Dr. Alan Davis at the Ohio State University. And this study really is a secondary analysis of their primary publication, looking at exactly, the effects of psychedelic use on racial trauma symptoms, but on a more diverse samples of people of color in North America. So just here is some funding information. I have no conflict of interest to disclose. And just launching right into the background and rationale for this study, there are many different pieces that led to the synthesis of this study here. On the one hand, this really was inspired by just rampant reports of anti-Asian violence in the COVID-19 pandemic that continues to this day. And just being more acutely aware of the history of anti-Asian sentiment in America's history. We know that Asians are at high risk for racial trauma and that anti-Asian racism and violence has increased during the pandemic. And it's important to pay attention to the occurrence of racial trauma among Asians in America, because we know that racial trauma is associated with various negative mental health consequences, including but not limited to PTSD. So depression, anxiety are common outcomes of chronic experiences of trauma, particularly when it impacts your unchangeable identity. On the other hand, there's an interesting portion of the psychedelic literature in looking at psychedelic use among Asians in rave settings, in club settings. So this was quite refreshing to me to discover that Asians would come together, form little friend groups and engage in psychedelic use in recreational settings. And digging deeper into the data as it pertains to the MDMA trials for PTSD, we come to understand that Asians tend to be overrepresented among the subsample of participants of color. And this is more recently in a recently published open label trial of MDMA for PTSD. So this really piqued my interest, and I was wanting to see if we can bring the two together to see if, would Asians engage in psychedelic use to address the effects of racial trauma? And if so, does that work? And does it have effects beyond the improvement of racial trauma symptoms? So as I mentioned, the primary publication was by Dr. Monica Williams and her co-authors, and they surveyed a really diverse sample of individuals of color from the United States and Canada. And they were specifically looking for people who have, one, experienced racial trauma to some extent, and two, have engaged in psychedelic use to address these occurrences of racial discrimination. Their main question of interest was to see if the use of psychedelics would be associated with decreases in racial trauma symptoms and psychological distress. And they did find that. So from the 30 days before their most meaningful psychedelic experience and the 30 days after that particular experience, they found that people improved in terms of racial trauma symptoms and psychological distress. They also added a few measures to look at the acute psychedelic effects and whether these different experiences, so mystical experiences, experiences of profound insights about their life and the world and others, and whether they had any challenging experiences. They found that these experiences were uniquely related to just improvements in racial trauma symptoms and psychological distress. So it is with this data set that we focused on the subsample of Asian participants for this study. Because we didn't want to just replicate the findings, we wanted to extend the study by looking at something that appears culturally relevant to Asians or people of color in general. And something that cuts across all ethnic and racial groups is the idea of ethnic identity, which is the sense of self as a cultural being, right? Like whether they feel committed or proud of their ethnic community and the extent to which they engage with their ethnic community by participating in customs and traditions and talking to people who look like them. We were interested in looking at ethnic identity because other parts of the literature have showed that ethnic identity can be a really helpful thing against the mental health effects of ongoing racial discrimination. So it may act as a way to buffer against the effects of racial discrimination. We considered ethnic identity too because we were wondering whether, improvements in ethnic identity could be a form of growth, a form of post-traumatic growth. So this is an interesting concept in the trauma literature because when people think of trauma, they naturally think of PTSD. But for people who do develop PTSD, at the same time, there's a sense of resilience among a certain subset of these individuals in that they find some meaning or a sense of grit from the effects of trauma. And it shows up and manifests as growth in the sense that they come to a deeper realization about their ability to cope with challenging experiences in their life. So we kind of thought of ethnic identity, the sense of being more attached to your ethnic community as a form of growth from chronic experiences of racial discrimination. And we really wanted to look at that in this study. And another thing that really supported this idea was from the social psychology literature, specifically the rejection identification model that hypothesizes that when people are discriminated against on the basis of their race or other forms of their identity or other aspects of their identity, they they tend to buckle down. They really like identify really strongly with that identity that is being discriminated against, so as to counter the effects of ongoing and future devaluation by society. So it's like, you know, if you call me a racial slur, I'm just gonna really buckle down and say I'm more proud of being, you know, Asian and specifically, and that your words can't harm me. So it's the sense of, you know, when people are rejected, they buckle down and they identify more strongly with that identity that is being discriminated against. So all these different pieces of evidence or parts of the literature point us to really being interested in the idea of ethnic identity as a construct to consider in this study. So the first hypothesis for this study is that, you know, it follows from the primary study that racial trauma symptoms would improve from before to after participants' most meaningful psychedelic experience. The second hypothesis is the novel one. It's where we introduce the idea of ethnic identity as the outcome of improvements in racial trauma symptoms. So specifically, we said that the relationship between acute psychedelic effects and ethnic identity would be mediated by improvements in racial trauma symptoms. So the final sample for the primary study had 313 participants, and only 92 of these were folks of Asian descent. As I mentioned, the eligibility criteria for the study was that they needed to have consumed psychedelics and just be older than 18 years old. These are the demographics of the sample. So people were kind of older, or just not older, but like they were of age. There was a fairly even split between cisgender male and female, and most of them were actually in Canada. So this is interesting for a Canadian audience. Most of them tend to be of lower middle to maybe even higher income levels, and the bulk of the sample were well educated. And just talking about the characteristics of their psychedelic use, we found that there was a fairly even distribution among the use of psilocybin mushrooms or LSD or MDMA for their most meaningful psychedelic experience. Most of these doses were moderate or higher, and there was a fair range in the duration of the experience, but most of it lasted a few hours. And time since experience, most of their most meaningful experience tended to vary in terms of how long ago it occurred. And some of them say that it occurred more than 10 years ago. And most of them denied the consumption of other psychoactive substances, but some of them did consume other psychoactive substances during their most meaningful psychedelic experience. Okay, so for the purposes of this study, these are the different measures that we were interested in. So general ethnic discrimination scale, it made sense for us to control for the frequency with which people experience discrimination as a covariate in this model. In terms of the acute psychedelic effects, we were interested in mystical, psychological, and challenging, or insightful and challenging experiences. In terms of racial trauma symptoms, we utilized the Trauma Symptoms of Discrimination scale. And in terms of ethnic identity, we looked at the multi-group ethnic identification measure. And we only assessed current ethnic identity. In terms of data analysis, to test the first hypothesis, we conducted really rudimentary paired t-tests to see if there would be change in racial trauma symptoms from before to after their most meaningful psychedelic experience. To test the second hypothesis, we conducted separate mediation analyses. So naturally, the acute psychedelic experiences were entered as separate predictors. The change in racial trauma symptoms were entered as the mediator, and ethnic identity was entered as the outcome. And in terms of whether there was an indirect effect, so an indirect effect is basically whether mediation is happening in the model. We looked at whether there would be a 0 in the confidence interval for the indirect effect. And I'll explain a little bit about what this means later. But just looking at the results, we basically corroborated the findings with the whole sample, in that for these Asian folks, after their most meaningful psychedelic experience, they experience a reduction in their racial trauma symptom severity. In terms of the mediation model, so this is the model for mystical experiences, the model for insightful experiences, and the model for challenging experiences. We found evidence of mediation only for the second model and the third model, but not the model for mystical experiences. Basically, the relationship between the occurrence of insightful experiences and current ethnic identity is fully mediated by reduction in racial trauma symptoms. While the model for challenging experiences, there is only partial mediation, because there still is a significant relationship between challenging experiences and ethnic identity. So what this means is, the more insightful experiences you have, the greater the reduction in your racial trauma symptoms, which predicts stronger ethnic identity. So for this model, the more or the fewer challenging experiences you have, the greater your improvements in racial trauma symptoms, which predict your current ethnic identity. So moving on to the discussion, this really is the first study to really empirically, systematically, and with a large enough sample to examine a potential benefit of naturalistic psychedelic use for reducing racial trauma symptoms among Asians specifically. So a lot of the research has focused on the use of qualitative methods, interviewing Asians that have consumed psychedelics recreationally, and not a lot of empirical quantitative research on the healing properties of psychedelic use for Asians. So it's exciting that we managed to contribute this study to the literature and point to the utility of psychedelics for healing among Asians, specifically when it comes to racial trauma symptoms. And in discussing the role of insightful psychedelic experiences, when people engage in psychedelic use and they have a really meaningful experience, they might have an acute awareness and just really healthy evaluations of their experiences of racial discrimination. And this is all completely speculative, because we do need to really probe into what the nature of those insightful experiences are. But it's possible that when people consume psychedelics and have a meaningful experience, part of those realizations may involve just recognizing that systemic racism, that the perpetrators of racism are to blame for their past experiences of discrimination. And that it's not because, like I deserve to get discriminated because I'm Asian or whatever. And it's because of this shift in thinking that may prompt some people to really strongly identify with and in fact be protective of their cultural background and their ethnic group. In terms of challenging experiences, we see that even though some people may have really difficult and challenging experiences during their psychedelic experience, there may be downstream positive effects on ethnic identity. And again, this is speculative, but like for some people who have challenging experiences, right? Like while they might not disclose their psychedelic use to members of their ethnic community, they may have just some realizations that they need to share with some people. And in seeking wisdom from people who look like them, it may lead to some resolutions of those questions for them, but also for them to feel closer to these people who look like them that have provided their wisdom or able to hold space for them in discussing these really challenging realizations about themselves. So I think it's maybe the idea that seeking support from other members in one's racial group after a psychedelic experience that may strengthen one's bond with the group and their sense of affiliation as a member of their community. So just to wrap up with some limitations and just direction for future research, the study really focused entirely on recall and estimation of their meaningful psychedelic experiences, some of which occurred more than 10 years ago. So there's certainly a lot of bias introduced in terms of what you recall, like the parts of your experience that you recall. And these people were self-selected. This was a hyper-selected sample, people who had experiences with racial discrimination and had engaged in psychedelic use. So we kind of need more prospective, longitudinal studies to really look ahead, maybe assess people who are planning to have a psychedelic experience so as to have more fresh memory of that experience and use that data for longitudinal analyses. We also needed a lot of information on the setting of their psychedelic experience. Like, did they do it with other people? Were there friends or supportive others around that might have facilitated the experience to be a more meaningful and maybe like a smoother journey than one that's more challenging if they were doing it alone. In terms of future research, maybe really looking at whether if they had someone there with them, whether it was someone of their ethnic group versus someone outside of their ethnic group, to just really see if there were incremental gains for doing psychedelics with someone who looked like them. And this is an important point to consider, especially for Asian folks, because a lot of the published literature have showed that Asians who consume psychedelics like to do it or exhibit a preference for doing it with people who look like them. So there's this sense of wonder about whether this might impact the nature of their psychedelic experience if they did it with someone outside of their ethnic group. And lastly, just to end it on this note, this study looked at ethnic identity, which really isn't a hyper-specific cultural construct to Asians. So future studies could really look at other more culturally specific variables. Do people endorse Asian cultural values to a higher extent after psychedelic use? do they engage in other customs and practices of their cultural group after psychedelic use, etc., in a way that's more responsive to the lived experiences of Asians. Like for me personally, like I'm a fan of Asian food, like, so a very relevant question to ask me after a psychedelic experience, if I were a participant, would be like, do you seek out Asian food? Do you cook more Asian food? Do you drink more boba, stuff like that? Like different things along those lines. So those are just some thoughts for how future studies could be refined to be more responsive to the cultural needs of different ethnic groups, including Asians. And just ending here, just acknowledging the research team that contributed to the collection of the data for the primary study. This is an important study, and I'm just really thankful for the invite to share these findings with everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ching, for an amazing presentation. Such an important topic, super interesting. Just a reminder to everyone, we're going to head into the Q&A now, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Also, definitely feel free to direct message me if you would like to keep them anonymous, and I will just read them in an anonymous manner as well. So one of our first questions here for you, Dr. Ching, is, was there any statistical significance between which substance created the most meaningful psychedelic experience?
I'm struggling to recall if we did include psychedelic type, but I think in our data organization process, we had looked at whether there was a relationship between psychedelic substance type and the outcomes of interest, and I believe there wasn't, so we didn't include that as a covariate. That's a good thought too, just different types of psychedelics, the heart opening MDMA versus the more classic psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD, whether that would lead to different experiences. But in this study, no.
Thank you. Next question here from Luke. Curious, if the experience of racial trauma leads people to identify stronger with their ethnic group, wouldn't an alleviation of racial trauma symptoms be associated with reduced or no change in their strength of ethnic affiliation?
If the experience of racial trauma leads people to identify stronger, yeah, I think that in this model, we control, first of all, for the frequency of racial trauma. So it may very well be that the findings might be different if we looked at different subsets of people who had higher frequency of discrimination versus those who had one or two instances of discrimination. In this model, we really looked at the idea of ethnic identity as an outcome, as a growth factor from the experience of trauma. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm happy to maybe have you clarify that question too.
Yes, for sure, Luke. Feel free to clarify if you have any other things that you want answered from that. I have another question here asking about, are you aware of any just general trends of usage of psychedelics amongst Asian populations, i.e. they're more used in millennials, like the study had more people around the age of 30. Also wondering if there's any data on if it tends to be kind of in more like rave situations, or if they are generally used at home or with friends, just kind of if there's any information on the context of use generally within the Asian population.
I wish I was a fly on the wall, for those moments. What the literature does show, of course, what gets published is extremely biased, and we might never know the true phenomenon of psychedelic use. We do know, if we look at national surveys of drug use, that Asians, like African American, Black and brown folks, tend to be lower in terms of their rates of use, lifetime prevalence speaking, across all age groups compared to their white counterparts. We do know from the qualitative literature that that has been published that Asians do consume psychedelics in club and rave settings, and preferably with people who look like them. So there may just be other aspects of the true phenomenon of Asians consuming psychedelics that haven't been reported on. And I'm just like, I continue to remain vigilant to popular media reporting of psychedelic use among Asians, but these are few and far in between. I do know that, I'm part of the Asian psychedelics group on Facebook, and there's just so few of us, and it's just a space for people to share their interest in the topic of psychedelics. So I'm making no claims that these people were consuming psychedelics. But yeah, I mean, there continue to be, I believe, different pockets of people who would connect with like-minded folks on the topic of psychedelics, whether they be consuming it themselves or just being curious about it. I do know that there has been conversations here and there in social media around what it's like to introduce or come out of the psychedelic closet to your family members. I think that's a really interesting topic. I've heard of case accounts of people introducing their parents to psychedelics for healing, and that has brought about a wonderful change in the relationship, from a place of disconnection to one of connection. So that's really hopeful to hear. And yeah, just doing this work and continuing to do more of this kind of work, hopefully we can push the psychedelic conversation into the mainstream where Asians are concerned.
Absolutely. And do you see any given Asian culture, and of course there are many Asian cultures, but are you aware of any reports of people saying that it is harder to bring this up to the older generations and maybe less acceptance compared to younger generations that are engaging in this type of use?
For me personally, I can't imagine this conversation with my grandparents. I have had this conversation with my parents, and that was, I wouldn't say it's easy or one that we've gone in depth about, because my professional life has centered on psychedelics, so it's bound to come up. For others, whose professional life don't center around psychedelics, i.e. they might be engaged with psychedelics in some capacity, maybe a recreational therapeutic capacity. I do wonder about whether they're able to have that conversation, come out of the psychedelic closet with their family. For me, I think there are just, because speaking from personal experience, there are factors to consider around the messages that we inherit intergenerationally around the use of drugs, especially for folks who have been through the war on drugs, folks who come from countries or backgrounds where drug use is highly stigmatized. And in fact, there are huge penalties associated with drug use. So for example, I come from Singapore, which is a country that still has the death penalty for the use, smuggling, possession, and trafficking of different illicit substances. So the message that I got as a kid of the 90s and 80s was that never use drugs, because using drugs means that you would become an addict and you will die or be killed by the government. So these are really harsh, extreme messages that I've inherited. So having that conversation with my parents, their first priority was to know that I was doing everything above board, like everything was legal, I'm covered, I'm going to be safe, legally speaking, doing this kind of work. And everything else is just kosher, you know, like they don't care really much about everything else. They just want to know that I'm okay doing this work. And I
Thank you so much
imagine
for
that
sharing.
there are examples of that in other people's lives, and not just specifically limited to Asians in general. People have different levels of stigma in talking about their interest in psychedelics.
Absolutely. I have another question here saying, you noted that a lot of the experiences with psychedelics were with moderate to higher doses. Do you see microdosing playing any role within this topic, or is there any research also looking at reduction of racial trauma with microdosing psychedelics?
I'm not aware. I think the best bet we have looking at these different subgroup analyses with microdosing is to look at data from maybe like the Global Drug Survey or something along those lines, looking at freely available data for that. But no, I'm not aware of any study going on right now, specifically looking at microdosing for folks of color or members of other marginalized groups for the express purpose of recovering from racial discrimination.
Interesting. Another question
I
here
do
is
think
that
it's worthwhile to look into that, though.
yeah, future direction for sure. Another question here is that you mentioned that there's kind of a realization or acceptance of the systemic and historical context of and reasons of you know how this racism has come down through history. Do you think that it could be for some people a benefit to be able to accept that and see that? Do you think also on the other side for some people that it could actually make their experience a lot harder and that they could potentially feel helpless in a way because of that?
I think the wonderful thing about psychedelics is that it opens your eyes to these really hard truths that it's always seeming like a double-edged sword. You know, it's healthy in the long run to come to terms with the harsh reality that maybe in certain spaces around the world that's going to be an ism that you run up against, but in other spaces around the world you can maybe breathe a little bit more. The wonderful thing about psychedelics is it offers like such a range of different experiences, but there's always meaning to be had from that. And I do think both of those things and everything in between is possible with a really meaningful psychedelic experience. So in terms of this study, people saw value in having those realizations, I imagine. But that's definitely like a speculation because we didn't really dive into the nitty-gritty of what those experiences are. I think it would be worthwhile to follow up on that with these participants, asking really clear, explicit questions. You know, did your psychedelic experience provide any insights around your unchangeable identities? You know, like that could be a great question to ask.
Thank you so much. So we will be wrapping up. Just one final question for you. Thank you so much for fielding all the many questions that we had today. And just, are there any plans for future studies extending upon the findings of the studies that are in the works right now?
I would have to point you to Dr. Monica Williams' lab. I think they're at the forefront of research where it concerns the intersection between diversity science and psychedelic science. We're collaborators. We remain really interested in continuing to diversify psychedelic spaces where clinical trials are concerned. But yeah, I can drop a link in the chat to Dr. Monica Williams's lab, and it's worthwhile to explore that website for any ongoing studies they may have in this area.
That would be really great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ching. That was a really interesting presentation on a super important topic. I know the audience got a lot out of it because we had lots of questions. And I will pass it back to Leo just to wrap things up.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I'm just going to include a couple of links in the chat here. This is our website, and if you would like to share our mailing list to anyone else, you can join it. And also Dr. Ching put his link in there as well. So thank you so much for that. So our next meeting is going to be on April the 7th. And right now we have one speaker, Matthew Banks, discussing the cellular neurobiology of psychedelics. So a little bit more on the techie side of things, but we're always on the lookout for new speakers as well. So if you guys have any suggestions, please send them our way. Our email, I don't think it's there, but it's journalclub@mapscanada.org. So if you guys have any suggestions, please send them our way. Thank you all so much for coming today, and we'll see you guys next month. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you again, Dr. Ching.
Thank you.